back, everyone. Now, how does this affect the way that we find fish? Okay. If the general color of the water in the lake that you're fishing in, let's just use an example. Let's say it's clear and green. Now, clear green water, it allows the sunlight to penetrate. If water is green, there's a very good chance that there's some type of algae growth in it, which is good for your smaller baitfish species, because most of them, or a lot of them, feed on algae, particularly your pelagic species. And sunlight penetration is important to bass for hunting, spawning, and usually clear green water has got a higher oxygen content level. There's no particulates in the water to make it dirty. So anything from clean water to stained water in most lakes is optimum. But if you live in an area where there's a lot of inflow into your lake from rivers, there's a very good chance that you're never going to experience it on that particular lake. So if you live on a lake where you have dirty water or muddy water, brown water, that's not necessarily a bad thing. The bass are used to living in that water. You just have to adjust the way that you fish, and we will cover that later on. Brown water can still have a good oxygen content if it's on a wind-blown bank or it gets regular movement of water. The oxygen content can be fine. The movement of the water is putting oxygen into the water all the time. Warm, dirty water is generally looked at and accepted as it's a good place to fish. Cold, rising, dirty water can be really, really tough to target fish in. So if you're looking at those general rules of thumb, when you're assessing a body of water, the first thing you want to do, look at the general color of the water in the lake. Then, if there's areas of inflow into the lake, little creeks, streams, rivers flowing into the lake, runoff off the land, whatever, where those areas are definitely areas that you want to have a look at. If it's early in the season and it's cold water flowing in, it might be more difficult to target fish in that area. If it's later in the season and there's cold water flowing in, it's better because it's cooling the water down in those areas. It will concentrate fish in those areas. Watercolor, although it's not at the top of the list of the most important things that you need to consider when you're going to target a particular body of water, is very important. So let's put that on the list as one of the things we need to do for homework. Now, what about changes in watercolor or fluctuations of water in a lake? It's a seasonal thing. It happens all the time. The bass that live in that lake, and this is something that we all need to understand together, they're used to it. Although it's a surprise to them when it happens, they're used to it. It happens their whole life. Don't be intimidated by it. Rising water, although not necessarily in the first couple of hours of rising water, but rising water can be a fantastic time of year to catch fish. It floods into bushes, small trees. New types of cover on the lake are getting flooded, and all the little critters and creatures that are in there will concentrate the baitfish species, and the bass will move in to feed. Falling water, slightly more difficult. The bass may be up in an area, the water starts to fall away from them for whatever reason. The bass will move back with the water. Don't be intimidated by it. We'll discuss falling water, how to target fish in falling water in a later episode. Now, a lot of you that live in America have something called drawdown, which a lot of other countries in the world don't experience. Drawdown can be a daily thing, especially on the Tennessee Valley lakes. It can be a daily thing. When they're generating electricity, drawdown happens. And that's just for power generation. But in the wintertime, lakes are also drawn down, and it's to allow for any flooding that may be forecasted or could occur in the wintertime. Drawdown is a particularly interesting time of year to fish because it can be very good or it can be really bad. Again, we'll talk about that later in a later episode. Water temperature, although it's spoken about a lot, in my experience, is not something that you should be intimidated by. It's more weather-related water temperature changes that are worrying. But don't be intimidated by a drop or a rise in water temperature. It can trigger bass feeding in incredible ways. I've experienced it several times in my life where you've been struggling for bites. You have a sudden downpour of rain, it drops the water temperature a few degrees, and it just triggers the fish to feed. It can happen that way. But water temperature is important for other things. When you're coming out of winter time and the water hits around, starts getting around the kind of upper 50s Fahrenheit, that's when fish start to think about moving. And as we discussed in the previous episode, the temperature of the surface water on those banks will rise first before the surface temperature water on other banks of the lake will rise. So that's something to bear in mind. Warming trends in the springtime will trigger spawning, not just from bass, but the things that bass eat. So that's something to just keep up there in the memory, because just like those changing temperatures will trigger the bass to spawn, they trigger the baitfish to spawn as well. So if the bass will spawn on those sun banks first, the baitfish will spawn on those banks first. It's all interconnected. And if the baitfish spawn on those banks first, that's where you're going to find the bass feeding up for the pre-spawn. And so it goes on through the year. When the temperatures hit around 64, 65 degrees Fahrenheit, that's when the fish start to spawn. They are happy to spawn at that temperature. So from that perspective, water temperature is important. If you're fishing in a lake and the surface temperature of your water on your graph, and it's difficult to determine from the bank, but on your graph is 72 degrees, and then you go into an area and the water temperature is 59, the surface temperature of the water. Bear in mind, guys, if you're using graphs for temperature on the water, that's just the surface temperature. It's the depth that your transducer is below the surface. It's not on the bottom if you're in 20 foot of water. It's that surface temperature, but it's an indication of what's going on with the water temperature. So if you're fishing in an area and the surface temperature is 72 degrees, and you move to your new spot and the temperature is 59 degrees, and all of a sudden you're not getting bites anymore, it may be temperature related. Small details that are important to keep up here, but are not at the forefront of what you're trying to do when you're trying to determine where fish are in your lake. Let's talk about the differences between cover and structure. In my previous video, when I was talking about the structure that fish would spawn on, that was not entirely correct. So the differences between cover and structure are, and we're going to put it in plain terms because I get it wrong all the time as well. Cover is something that bass will use to hide or to ambush from or to stay close to. Structure is something that always exists in the lake. So, for example, if you look at a topographic map of your lake and there are hard breaks, if you can see defined breaks on the map going down from shallow water to deep water, those individual breaks on the map are structure. If you are going through an area on your boat, and on the chart on your boat, it indicates that there's rocks in that particular area, that is structure. If you are fishing on a lake that's got it will probably be a reservoir that's got a lot of sunken timber on it, and it indicates it on the chart, on your paper chart or your electronic chart on your boat or your plotter, that there's timber and there's a lot of standing timber or sunken timber in that area, and it indicates it on the chart. That is structure. So what is cover? Well, cover is something that's either fallen into a lake or been put there by man, or it's introduced into an environment. So cover would be blowdowns, lay down trees from the lake lying into the lake, docks. Now you could say that a permanent dock in a lake, a dock or a jetty that doesn't move, is structure. And yes, in a way it is, because the footings, as we've discussed, are permanently in the lake. They're never going to move. So although it's might not be indicated on a map, the footings of that dock become structure and not cover. We're not going to get technical about it. It's just an example. So anything could be considered cover. It could be a brush pile that's been put into the lake and you find it whilst you're going along on your sonar. It could be a sunken boat. If a bass can use something to ambush out of, we could consider that cover. An area that a bass could feel safe, we could consider that cover. Emergent weeds, grass, tulies, bulrushes and for my South African brothers, or reeds. So let's say cover is a place that bass can feel safe or where it could potentially ambush food from. And structure is something in a lake that never changes. So how do these structures and covers affect the life cycle of a bass, or where to determine in a lake where bass would live? If you are in a lake that is, and as a lot of the lakes are in America, a massive lake that has vast areas of bank that have not a lot on them, mud banks, shell banks, whatever the case is, and there is a single rock in 100-yard stretch of that bank, that'd be a good place to start looking for a fish. It's something that's different on that bank. If you're going down a relatively straight bank and there's one laydown or blowdown on that bank, that'd be a good place to start looking for a fish. It becomes more tricky in areas where there is a lot of cover in a lake. Standing timber, big rock boulder fields, but a lot of grass, a lot of reeds. The trick then becomes to determine where or what type of cover or structure the fish are using in that lake. So, how does that work? Well, like we've discussed before, there's two different types, in my opinion, of bass that live in lakes. You have a resident population of fish that very rarely leave their area, and you have migrant populations of fish that move in and out of an area, which could be determined by food, it could be determined by water clarity, condition, temperature, weather, which we're going to discuss at a later stage, anything like that. It's fairly safe to say that good cover on a lake will generally hold a fish. But it's also safe to say that good structure on a lake will also generally hold a fish. Now, everything is relative. So if you live in an area where the deepest part of the lake is 15 foot of water, that's your deep water. If you live in a lake where the deepest part of the lake is 150 foot of water, that's your deep water. But generally speaking, populations of fish on a normal day-to-day basis, sun, wind, whatever the case is, will live in slightly deeper water relative to the lake that you are fishing on, and will move up shallow to feed. Now, that might be a depth change of only 1 foot. They may live in 5 feet of water, which is the deep water in that particular area of the lake, and they move up to 0 foot, a few inches, to feed during the day. It may be that they live in 30 foot of water, and they move up to 1 foot of water to feed. It varies from lake to lake to lake. So that is not really something that we can discuss at length. That's something that you've got to determine yourself on your particular home body of water. There are times when bass will move to deeper water. There's times when bass will move tighter to structure. We'll get into that. Most of that is weather related. We'll deal with those individually because it gets a little bit tricky. There's so many factors that have to be taken into account that it may seem like this is an insurmountable riddle that we're trying to solve as to where to start looking for a fish. But once it becomes second nature and you do your homework, like we've discussed before, which is easy, once you get the hang of it, it will take you a few minutes to do it before you go out on your fishing trip for the weekend or whatever the case is, or the day. It becomes like second nature to you. And it seems like a lot of information that you've got to process now. But once you've done the initial work and you've worked out a system, and I'll tell you how I worked out my system, and it's super easy. And you've got a system in place for planning for your next fishing trip. Life is good. It's simple. But these fundamental things that we're discussing now are the things that you are going to have to get dialed in before you take those steps to go out and start planning for your day's fishing or your weekend's fishing, whatever the case might be. A lot of the things that I learned tournament fishing, I wish I'd known when I was starting out. And not all of you will be interested in tournament fishing, and a lot of you may never fish a tournament in your lives because you have no interest in it. That's cool. This channel is not about tournament fishing. But some of the information that I've learned through tournament fishing, we're going to bring into this to help you determine, to get maximum results for the limited amount of time that you've got on the water to spend by yourself or with your family or your friends, to put as many fish in the boat as possible. We see you next time. Thanks for joining. It's been good.